My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to do a topic that at least one or two people have requested and that I've been meaning to do for a while anyway, which is to talk about the adventures of Tom Bombadil. Sorry for the glossy book cover, maybe should have taken that off. For those of you who have read The Lord of the Rings, or who have seen at least stuff online, including maybe my own video on Tom Bombadil, and I'll link to those videos that I've done in the description below, you'll know who Tom Bombadil is. If you don't, go and watch my videos on the Tom Bombadil chapter and those surrounding it. I'll link to those, like I said, to give you an idea who Tom Bombadil is. For those of you who do know who he is and are not familiar with this particular book, don't get too excited. It's not a short story or anything like that about Tom Bombadil. It's actually a collection of poems. And most of them are not actually about Tom Bombadil. In fact, some of them are taken straight from The Lord of the Rings, like Sam's poem about the troll that he recites when they actually come across the three trolls that were turned to stone in The Hobbit. If you've not read the book, you don't know what I'm talking about there either. But there's various different poems, but a lot of the poems you won't find anywhere else really. So this book has a bunch of different poems, but the first two, which are also the longest, I think, are about Tom Bombadil, and so I want to talk about those two in particular in this video, and at some point later I may do a video on the other poems. I'm not much of a poetry person, so I don't know if I'll ever really do one on those, but the two that are about Tom Bombadil are interesting insofar as Tom Bombadil is an interesting character, and the adventures he does get into in these poems, well, if you know what Tom Bombadil's story is in The Lord of the Rings, you'll understand why these are interesting. So, with that said, let's take a look at the first poem. In the first poem, we get introduced to Tom in much the same way that we get introduced to him in The Lord of the Rings. In The Lord of the Rings, he comes around a corner singing a song about himself, saying that his bright blue his jacket is and his boots are yellow, some other things about him being a merry fellow. That becomes important later on, believe it or not. It starts off with that, and then it tells us that he kind of goes out and wanders around. He's kind of just enjoying nature, it seems. He's, dealing with butterflies and bumblebees, and next thing you know, he's sitting by the willow reeds in a pool or a river, and his beard is kind of dangling in the water. And then it says that Goldberry, the river daughter, who apparently is not married to Tom Bombadil yet, for those of you who know that she is in The Lord of the Rings, pulls him into the water and basically complains that he's bugging the wildlife in the river with his beard being dangled in the water. He comes out sputtering, basically tells Goldberry to go back and sleep at the bottom of a shady pool near the willow roots. He's not into wading in the water at the moment, and basically that's kind of their encounter. And now the second part, he actually sits on the willow roots himself, and if you've read Lord of the Rings or you've seen my videos, then you know that that's an ominous thing to do. He's trying to dry off after his encounter with Goldberry, the river daughter, and next thing you know, the Willow Man, which is essentially a sentient tree, sings him to sleep and then swallows him up, much as the willow tree does to Merry and Pippin in the Lord of the Rings story. Tom Bombadil, of course, wakes up and realizes he's trapped in the tree and tells the Willow Man, hey, let me out, it's not comfortable in here, and tells the Willow Man to also go to sleep, much as he told Goldberry to go to sleep, and then the Willow Man lets him out. And at the end of this section, we see Bombadil kind of walking off as the sun is starting to get a little bit low and clouds begin to gather. In the next section of the poem, what we have is rain has indeed begun to fall. And seeking shelter, Bombadil finds a hole, which turns out to be the home of a family of badgers. And the badgers kind of see him hanging out in their hole. They grab him, pulling down deep into the hole, and basically say, you'll never find your way out again. He, of course, gets a little irate at this, basically says, you let me out by the back door near the rose bush, which they do. He also tells them to go to sleep. He's telling everybody to go to sleep, which seems an interesting connection. And the last thing we know about the badgers is after they show him out by the back door near the rose bush, it actually does say they let him out in a thorny patch. Then they block up all the entrances with dirt from their holes. So he, has escaped again, and now he moves on yet again. Now, at the end of the day, Tom Bombadil comes home, and it's dark. He lights a candle, goes upstairs to get ready for bed, and when he opens the door to his bedroom, he hears a voice from behind the door basically saying, "I've got you now," basically, and it's a Barrow Wight. And again, if you don't know what that is, go watch my videos. I'm serious. You'll want to know all this material. But the Barrow Wight basically says he's going to take him, and I mean, he doesn't use the words, but basically says he's going to kill him. He's going to make him cold, and well, if not kill him, at least make him not really alive either. So Tom Bombadil, of course, also tells off the Barrow Wight, tells the Barrow Wight to go flee back to his mound wherever he came from, and again go to sleep, interestingly enough. So naturally, the Barrow Wight does exactly that, flees out the window, and Tom Bombadil is left at home in peace. Now, in the final part of the poem, we see Tom waking up, or it may not be the very next day, but certainly some day later, and it says that Tom is now not a merry fellow, but it says wise Tom is a wary fellow, interestingly enough, because he's obviously been a little less than cautious up to this point, having been taken in or nearly caught by various different creatures. But now it says that none has ever caught him, but one day he went and caught the river daughter, meaning Goldberry, of course, and basically tells Goldberry, "You come with me, the table is laden," and he says what the table is laden with. And if you know the story from The Lord of the Rings, then you will know that the things that his table is laden with and kind of the general layout that he describes is very much what the hobbits find when they enter the house of Tom Bombadil in their own adventure. And he also tells Goldberry, "You won't find a lover at the bottom of the pool, so come with me." Well, she does come with him. They do have a wedding, and they basically, after that, they live together, and it says that they sleep together, not heeding any of the noises of the various other creatures that they've encountered, including the Goldberry's mother sighing, the Barrow Wight moaning, the badgers scurrying around, and the willow tree knocking on the window. So at the end of the day, Tom Bombadil has escaped all his perils, won himself a wife, and doesn't really worry about any of those other things anymore, because now he apparently is a much wiser, warier being than he was at the beginning. So unlike the first poem, where we have a pretty clear indication that it happens before The Lord of the Rings, we don't really get a perfectly clear indication of when this poem happens, except the very end kind of hints that it probably happens around the time of or shortly after The Lord of the Rings. But you'll see what I mean when I get there. The first part of the poem has Tom at apparently the beginning of autumn or sometime during autumn thinking, "It's a lovely day. I'm going to take a ride in my boat. I'll fix it up, sail down not sail, but, row down the Withywindle, which is the river that flows through the old forest, and see where I end up." A bird nearby sees him doing this and kind of asks him where he's going or whatever, and Tom basically says, "Don't you go telling people, particularly Old Man Willow, where I'm going, or I'll roast you." And the bird basically says, "Well, I'm going to go tell him that you're going such and such a way." Well, Tom hadn't really said where he was going at that point, but after that he says, "I think I will go that way." Almost to spite the bird and basically be like, I can take Old Man Willow anyway. And then shortly after that, you get another bird, presumably a kingfisher, because the old Tom calls him a fisher, but it's not really clear exactly what he means. It just says fisher. But anyway, the bird asks him where he's going, and he says, "I'm going down to Hayes End," and that's actually a part of the Shire, or at least on the borders of the Shire. I don't remember exactly the location. And the bird says, "Well, can you take tidings to people I know there?" And Tom basically says, "I'm not going to run errands. I'm just out for a pleasure cruise, so no." The bird apparently doesn't really like this answer, and so he kind of makes veiled references to, not very veiled really, but references to Tom foundering in his boat on willow snags. Clearly, probably a reference to Old Man Willow, and seemingly kind of, he doesn't say it this way, but the bird seems to be saying, well, I hope you sink. So, but as the bird flies off, he drops a blue feather, which Tom picks up and puts in his hat. Next, Tom, on his way down the river, sees a shadow in the water and hits it. Turns out to be an otter. The otter, in anger, of course, at being smacked, threatens to bring his whole family to attack Tom. And Tom basically says, well, I'll give you to the Barrow-wights if you try to do that. And that kind of ends that encounter. Shortly after the otter, he then runs into a swan who doesn't really say anything but gives him kind of a dark look and snorts at him. And Tom kind of makes reference to the fact that he's a little bit too prideful. And he makes an interesting comment about if the king returns, he'll brand your bill. And king is capitalized. Now, Tom Bombadil, of course, is old enough to know that once upon a time there was a king in the northern part of Middle-earth, in Arnor, and he seems to be referring to possibly the return of the king, in the sense of Aragorn becoming king again and visiting the northern kingdom of Arnor. It's not really clear, but certainly in the context of The Lord of the Rings, that seems to be the most likely explanation of what he means, since I don't know what else he would mean by, if the king returns. Anyway, that's the best I can make out of that, but it certainly is an interesting allusion. I forgot to mention this earlier, but one of the things that Tom said to the fisher was that he would visit little people. Now, that obviously seems to be a reference to hobbits. Well, in the next part of the poem, he actually does encounter some little people, again, not referred to by the name hobbit, but presumably that's what they are, and they don't really seem to like Tom Bombadil. They seem to take a dim view of him because he's coming from the Old Forest, which is not exactly a place that the hobbits really care for obvious reasons, if you know the history. Old Forest has been dangerous in the past, and rather interesting, strange things happen there. So anyway, they threaten to attack him with bows. Tom kind of taunts them about their cowardice, saying, I've seen people like you make holes when, animals come along, and you're scared of everything, basically. I'll send orcs after you if you try to bother me. And the hobbits say, well, we're not afraid of you. And they stick some arrows in his hat. And Tom leaves, basically saying, well, if you had just welcomed me, I would have blessed you, but I'm on my way. And I don't remember if it's in this section or earlier, but you get the idea that he's planning to meet somebody at his destination. So that's basically what happens next. Now, Tom Bombadil then comes to a pier. It doesn't use the word pier, it uses causeway, but I'm assuming it's a pier since he's, using a boat to get there. And it's nighttime. He starts walking along. You get the idea that he's disappointed because nobody's there to meet him. He mentions something about that. As he's walking along, he is accosted by somebody in a cart with ponies. Now, I don't think I've done a video on Farmer Maggot yet. I'll have to look back through my old videos and check. If I haven't, I do need to do one because it's an interesting little episode, certainly. But if you know The Lord of the Rings from the book, at least, you will know the Farmer Maggot part of the story, that Frodo and the other hobbits, other than Merry, who had gone on ahead, visit him. In fact, I'm pretty sure I have done a video on it. I'll have to find it. If I do, then I will link to that in the description below. But anyway, Farmer Maggot had visited with the three hobbits other than Merry, and he turns out to know quite a bit of things going on. And later on in The Lord of the Rings, Tom Bombadil actually makes a reference to Farmer Maggot being a pretty good guy and knows more than he lets on. Well, anyway, Farmer Maggot in the story takes Frodo, Pippin, and Sam by cart to the Buckleberry Ferry. Well, here Tom meets Farmer Maggot on the road in his cart, and Maggot kind of throws some insults his way, and then Tom throws some insults back the other way. You get the idea that either Farmer Maggot doesn't recognize Tom at first, or if he does, he's just being jovial, because after Tom throws his insults back, including, you really ought to know who I am, and you weren't waiting for me like we agreed, they start laughing, and then they go to Farmer Maggot's house. The Maggot family then greet Tom, and they have basically a party. I mean, they have singing and stories and all sorts of things. Everybody else goes to bed except Tom and Farmer Maggot. And then this is the most interesting part of the poem to me, because it really gives the connection that I was mentioning earlier about the timing of the poem. Because it says that they talk about various different things, including queer tales from Bree, which is probably a reference to the things that happened to Frodo and company in The Prancing Pony. Watchers at the Fords, which is probably a reference to Dunedain Rangers watching out for the Shire. Shadows on the Marches, which is probably a reference to Nazgul. And they're mentioning all these different things, and there's also like a reference to whispering in the trees, which seems to maybe be a reference to the not so nice things that Old Man Willow gets up to in the Old Forest. So you get the idea that a lot of what they're talking about here is actually connected to Frodo's escape from the Shire, which is really interesting. Now the question is, does this happen before or after the actual events of the Lord of the Rings where all these things happen? It's not really made clear, but certainly it seems that both of them are aware, and it fits in with the story of the Lord of the Rings, because in there it mentions that Maggot and Tom Bombadil do trade a lot of information. So that's how Bombadil learns a lot of what he knows that's going on in the outside world beyond the borders of the Old Forest. So anyway, they have their little talk, and then the poem basically ends saying that Tom Bombadil wakes up before dawn and leaves without a trace. The rain washes away his footprints. He doesn't make any noise as he's leaving. Nobody sees him go, and he's like a dream half remembered. So it's like almost like he was never there and just not really sure it ever happened. So it's kind of an interesting end to that poem. So that's the two poems. Now I just want to make a few general comments about both of them. Okay, so while we can see from these poems that, well, we don't get a whole lot of information about what Tom Bombadil is or what he does as a general rule, but they certainly do give us a little extra insight, more than what we get in The Lord of the Rings, about Bombadil's character and some of the antics that he gets up to. Certainly in the first poem we see that Tom Bombadil may not have always been quite the master, as he is repeatedly called, in the sense that he was never quite as supreme in his own realm, since he could be hoodwinked by Old Man Willow and whatnot. He always had more power and could always escape the situations, but didn't seem to be the one that was, constantly on top of everything else. And in the second one, we get the idea that he definitely is familiar with hobbits, and it it kind of fits in with the whole story about him knowing Farmer Maggot, getting information from Farmer Maggot, and that sort of thing. And the allusions to those things that probably are references to Lord of the Rings are rather interesting. But the poems themselves are really, if you read the poems, they're really just kind of whimsical in a lot of ways. There is another aspect to the poems that I don't want to talk about here that plays into a theory that I am developing about not necessarily what Tolkien had in mind when he was creating the character of Tom Bombadil, but certainly an aspect of his character that I think is worth analyzing in and of itself, and which I think is sort of archetypal, but I'll save that for another video because I don't want to spoil it or give it away. But the idea in these two poems is certainly that Tom Bombadil gets into a lot of interesting situations, and you kind of get that idea from the Lord of the Rings anyway, that he's constantly getting into who knows what kinds of trouble or near trouble. But the poems themselves, like I say, don't tell us a whole lot. They're not coherent stories in the traditional sense. They are more, as poems tend to be, but probably metaphorical and more symbolic in that they describe the kind of person that he is, not necessarily probably specific events that happen. I mean, Barrow-wights in his house. Given what we know about Barrow-wights, that seems pretty unlikely. So I don't think we're supposed to necessarily take that as something that really happened to Tom Bombadil, but I suppose you could. Anyway, I think these two poems are pretty interesting. Like I said, there's a lot of other poems in the book itself that aren't really about Tom Bombadil at all. It's just a collection of different poems. But it's definitely worth picking up. Some of the poetry in it is quite nice. And the ones about Tom Bombadil are, as I say, kind of whimsical. So if you're kind of into that sort of poetry, then you'll definitely enjoy it. So definitely do pick up the book if you're interested. And it's, of course, I can't go into all the detail here. There's more to pick out of these poems than I've gotten to in this short video. But this at least gives you a taste of what the Adventures of Tom Bombadil, the first two poems anyway, are. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you got an idea of whether you'd like to pick up The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. As I said, if you enjoy, well, really poetry in general, you'll enjoy the book because it's nothing but poetry. And of course, Tolkien's poetry is, in my opinion, some of the best out there. Even when it's not the highest quality, he's at least doing something interesting with it. But anyway, that's, like I said, I'll link to some of the other videos that I've done on this topic to give you some background if you're not familiar with Tom Bombadil from the actual Lord of the Rings. I'll also link to my video on the history of Arnor since I mentioned that, and I will, I think that's probably all the videos I need to do is the ones on Tom Bombadil and the surrounding chapters, the Kingdom of Arnor, and I know I mentioned another one, but I'll catch it. Anyway, if you did enjoy the video, please give it a thumbs up, share it around. You can also follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. You can subscribe to me by pressing this button here, and you can find a couple of my previous videos here. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.